Thank you very much.
Yes, the boat has 2 days. This one, no.
This one is a 6 o'clock sightseeing cruise. You'll have to check in with the ticket office to see which one's 7:30.
6 o'clock. Okay.
You can sit wherever you like.
Not like they're not building it, it was not accepted. On the other side of the porch, of the bridge, was a porch called Dearborn. Dearborn was massacred.
Batman: The Dark Knight, which was filmed in there while the building was still under construction. So if it doesn't look, I know I would have loved in college to have a riverfront view from the classroom. But none of the classrooms in this building have riverfront views. The big windows are for the student lounges. The classrooms are where we see those big sandstone boxes sticking out of the side of the building. There's no windows at all in the classrooms. It's to protect the audio-visual equipment and also to prevent bored students from gazing out the windows and daydreaming about being out here on boats instead. Now, beyond the University of Chicago's Bleacher Center, we can see a narrow tower with a peacock on the top. This is NBC Tower, designed by the architecture firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. Now, it's got these black panels underneath the windows that are typical of a style of architecture called Art Deco, which was very popular in the late 1920s, early 1930s. But this building wasn't built until the early 1980s. So it's not an Art Deco building, it's what we call an Echo Deco building because it's got echoes of the Art Deco style. Now, if you think you've seen that building somewhere before, you might be right if you've been to New York City. Bulletproof glass, because they take that word presidential very, very seriously. Presidents have actually stayed in the Sheraton Hotel over the years, including President Clinton, including George Bush, including Senator Hillary Clinton. But notice I haven't mentioned Barack Obama. That's because he's from Chicago. So when he visits the city, he just brings a couple extra Secret Servicemen, stays at his own house in Hyde Park. Nice to be able to visit your own place every now and again, right? Now we're going to proceed out towards the lake, and there's going to be this fountain here coming up on our left-hand side with water cascading down. Well, what we're seeing looks very nice, but what we're seeing is only about 2/3 of the water attraction of the fountain. The rest of it, there's a little purple pyramid on the water's edge with a hole cut out of it. That purple pyramid is a water cannon that goes off every hour on the hour, shoots an arc of water all the way across the river for 10 straight minutes. So if we were first to avoid an unnecessary shower in our day. Now the name of this fountain is the Nicholas J. Mealis Centennial Memorial Fountain. Great big long name, I just call it Centennial Fountain for short. It was built to mark the 100th anniversary of the Chicago River reversal. See, the Chicago River used to flow into Lake Michigan because back then nobody had heard of environmental protections. Good, we've got a boat full of very sensible people. I like that. Now, that's basically what we were doing here in Chicago. We were not that sensible. We were drinking water from Lake Michigan where our river was flowing into. People were getting very, very sick. By 1890, we were losing nearly 1/10 of the city a year to severe waterborne illnesses like typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. Went out there anyway. So people started getting sick again. Finally, what we had to do was we had to turn the whole river around in order to make the pollution finally leave the lake. And the way we did that was we dug out a great big canal. It's called the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. It connects the south end of the Chicago River up with the north end of the Des Plaines River, which flows into the Illinois, into the Mississippi, ultimately ending up at the Gulf of Mexico, way far away from where we're getting our drinking water from. Now this canal, in order to make the water go away from the lake, it had to be dug out 3 times deeper than the average depth of the Chicago River. And it took about 10 years to dig out. This canal is so big, they actually moved more dirt and rock for the creation of the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal than for the creation of the Panama Canal that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. That's how big this canal is. Now, it was a huge success. Once the last dam was blown out, water started pouring down like a waterfall in to fill up that canal. Pouring down, pulled the whole river with it, and the river's been flowing backwards ever since. And what that means is also Lake Michigan has been flowing into the Chicago River ever since. And that's why there are these big concrete walls around us. They're holding back the water of Lake Michigan so that we can regulate the flow of the lake into the river. They've had big engines and generators to open up the doors. They would have used lever arms or gears so that people and draft animals could push and pull on the doors to open and close them. We are turned inside the locks once those boats are out of them. You see those big gray doors that the Linnea is sailing past right now? Those are what opened to let those boats out. We do things like start taking photos of the skyline. If you need to go downstairs to use the restroom, it's a good time to do that too. If you want to get any refreshments, it's a good time to do that. And I'll also give you a little warning. If you're in the front of the boat, once we're out on Lake Michigan, you might get a little bit wet. If you catch the wind and the waves just right, sometimes water comes splashing over the front of the boat. Can't guarantee that you'll get wet, but I can't guarantee you'll stay dry either. So just a little heads up. I'll be having to step off the microphone now that we're heading into the locks, and I will be back before you know it once we're out on Lake Michigan.
Están cerrando la esclusa para que sube el nivel del agua. Fíjate cómo One second. No worries, thank you. Some snacks. प्रेशर आ रहा है ना, तो इसलिए थोड़ा सा बोला हम लेवल हो जाएगा हमारा पूरा थोड़ा फिर थोड़ा और खोल दिया बोल रहा ना, और बढ़ा देख पर आते हैं पर हां भाई दिन पर है लिया
When all that ice melted, it retreated, formed the Great Lakes. So these Great Lakes are gigantic. They are so big that they hold about 1/5 of the world's fresh water. 20% of the fresh water in the world is right here in the Great Lakes. Now, these Great Lakes, the smallest is Lake Switzerland. Yeah. Of course, there aren't nearly as many nice mountains on Lake Michigan as there are in Switzerland. Museum, a botanical garden, an amusement park, a circus, the world-famous Chicago Shakespeare Theater. There's conference rooms for rent. There's a food court. There's a beer garden where everybody was gathered listening to the music. And underneath that green dome at the very end is a ballroom of the four tallest buildings. The tapering black building with the diamond shapes on the sides and the antennas on the top is the John Hancock Center. That is the fourth tallest building in the city. It stands 1,125 feet tall. If any of you got an urban adventure package, you've got tickets to go up to the field deck up there. There is a field deck up there. It's called 360. In honor of the fact that there are 360 degrees of view of Chicago. There's windows on the left. That's exactly what fire got started about 2 miles inland from Museum Campus, where it turned around at the south end of Chicago. That started on a family farm, and the wind spread the fire in Millennium Park, which were those two great big parks at the water's edge, sort of in front of where we saw the Sears Tower. Those didn't used to be there. those used to just be a nice marshy area. So there was too much stuff growing in to use boats there, but there was too much water in it to really walk around and enjoy it. Well, after the fire, we had to put all of those 17,000 burned down buildings somewhere. We pushed them out of the way into Lake Michigan and made a festival. And most famously, just a couple weekends ago, the Lollapalooza Music Festival happened there. Drew thousands of people from all over the world right here to Chicago. We've got to hang out here for a minute while we wait for those locked doors to open. For those of you who are downstairs in the front, or if you look carefully off the right-hand side, if you look behind that first bridge, you can see that arc of water shooting all the way across the river from that fountain that I told you about earlier, from the Centennial Fountain. And where Chicago comes from. The most famous thing for Chicago, of course, is the Windy City. And you might think it comes from all this wind we're feeling here on the lake, but it's actually because of our politicians. Specifically, the politicians advertising Chicago as a possible host for a World's Fair that we had back in 1893 called the World Columbian Expo. Now, the World Columbian Expo was a fair that was being held to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering the New World. Just like the World Cup or the Olympics, cities bid and compete to see who gets to host a World's Fair. And so we were competing with New York, St. Louis, D.C., a couple other cities to see who was going to get to host this World's Fair that would draw tourists from all over the world. Well, 1893, that's when we're digging out that great big sanitary and ship canal, so we've got to figure out some way to pay for this thing. We wanted to have that World's Fair to help pay for that big canal, so our politicians went to work advertising. They said, we should have this fair here in Chicago. We've got the busiest seaport in the country, busiest railway station in the country. We can bring people and buy land and buy sea. Well, with a sales pitch like that, of course we won the contract, and this made other cities jealous, especially New York. And a jealous newspaper man from New York City decided he would come out to Chicago before preparations for the fair were underway at all to see what that fuss was about. He got out here, he saw that Chicago still had dirt roads. Start talking again. So welcome back to the Chicago River. We're going to head down that, get up close and personal with some of these buildings here, including this black building off our right-hand side. It looks like a stretched out 3-leaf over. That black building, Lake Point Tower, is much closer to the water's edge of Lake Michigan than it is on our skyline. It was built exploiting a loophole, a weakness in the laws that are protecting our coastline from development. Laws close the loophole, no other buildings can go in anywhere near Lake Point Tower. That's a residential building. Everybody who lives there has to continue to live here as long as our coastline is protected from development. And these guaranteed good news have brought many celebrity residents. So it theoretically helps to celebrate 100 years of Chicago as a city. But because it was the 1930s, that was also the Great Depression. And it helped to boost jobs and generate morale at a time when not a lot of people had jobs, not a lot of people had a way to make money or to have fun. So we had this big World's Fair to help fix that here in Chicago, and it had such a positive impact. We've immortalized it to this day on our flag. Now, occasionally there's talk of adding a fifth star for this mayor or for that historical event, but I bet you they're just waiting until it comes to the World Series. I don't see that fifth star pop up. They might be waiting for a little while, though. Now, if we look off our left-hand side, as we head back on the river, we look behind this sort of stripy building, you can see a building peeking up over the top of it with wavy balconies. That wavy balcony building back there is called Aqua. And it's the tallest building in the world, designed by a female-headed architecture firm. The architect in this question is Jeannie Gang, and her architecture firm, Studio Gang, is right here out of Chicago. Now, aqua means water in many different languages, and it was water that inspired Jeannie Gang when she designed this building. You can see those balconies are so wavy, they look like water flowing down the sides of the building. And in fact, no two of those balconies are the same size or shape. They range from 1 foot in depth to over 12 feet deep, and each one of them is unique. And that uniqueness to them, of course, it's very beautiful, but it's also functional. For one thing, it helps reduce wind noise, because if it was a flat-sided building, the wind could go zipping by fast as you please. But when you pull each of those balconies as a different size and shape, the wind has to change course around each one of them. Every time it changes course, it slows down a little bit and gets quieter. Right in front of us is the Trump Tower I mentioned before. And one thing you can see at the Trump Tower right now is really cool is each of the terraces lines up with another building on the skyline. The lowest terrace of the Trump Tower lines up with the cornice height of the Wrigley Building. The cornice height is that lowest ceiling. The Wrigley Building is that white building with the Trump Tower on top. That was one of the first skyscrapers built on the north side of the Chicago River. It was built in 1921, and prior to the 1920s, most of our business district was south of the Chicago River in the area that's known as the Loop, because the elevated trains make a big loop there. Now, once the Michigan Avenue Bridge was opened up, well, this formerly residential area became a retail corridor. And the Wrigley Building is sort of one of the first buildings to go in there. Now, Wrigley today, we know that for chewing gum, but William Wrigley got his start selling baking soda and soap powder. But chewing gum began its name in the Wrigley because he wasn't especially good, unfortunately, at selling baking soda and soap. Family friend of his gave him the recipe for chewing gum. He started including a free stick of gum with every purchase of soap. All of a sudden, sales went through the roof. He realized people were buying extra soap just to get more gum. So he switched his focus over to chewing gum, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, coming up on our left-hand side here is a boxy tan building with big fancy towers on the corners and a dome that's partly covered in scaffolding. That's the Jewelers Building for Chicago, built around 1926. As you may have guessed from the name, it was built to be offices for Chicago's jewel merchants. Well, the 1920s are the gangster years here in Chicago. We had lots of mobsters here. And the jewelers were afraid to move their jewels on the street because they were afraid they'd be stolen. And so there was an extra security feature inside the Jewelers Building at first. There was a car elevator, so the jewelers could drive their cars full of jewels into the building, take the elevator up to the right floor, and unload it on the street. But what's funny about that is there was a wolf in the sheepfold. That dome at the top of the building used to be one of the highest points in the city, making it a great place to have a speakeasy, an illegal nightclub, which was a favorite hangout of one of Chicago's most famous gangsters ever, Mr. Al Capone himself, who was the only other person to have permission to use that car elevator in case he needed to make a quick getaway. Well, we are going to go underneath a bunch of bridges today. All of the bridges we go underneath, they all open and close. Chicago has the second most movable bridges of any of the cities in the world, second most after Amsterdam. Now, these are very beautiful, of course. They're also not able to be opened on demand, otherwise we'd have it as Wacker Drive. Now, if you're not from Chicago, I recommend avoiding Wacker Drive if at all possible. because it's very confusing. There's a North Wacker Drive, an East Wacker Drive, a West Wacker Drive, a South Wacker Drive, an Upper and Lower Wacker Drive. Wacker Drive is actually part of a gentleman named Daniel Burnham's 1909 plan to help alleviate traffic congestion in Chicago. So the upper level is intended for pedestrians, commuters, tourists, and the like. The lower box, we specialize in what's called contextual style architecture, buildings inspired by their surroundings. And if we look up at the top of 225 West Wacker Drive, we can see this building inspired by the bridges. We've got two towers up there connected by a little bitty bridge up there. That's pretty nifty. Now, Cohn Pedersen Fox also designed the next building on our left-hand side. This curving green glass building is the new Reed building. Sits at 333 West Wacker Drive. This building was inspired by the Chicago River itself. Actually selected to match the color of Chicago's river water. We think of ourselves as having a green river here in Chicago rather than a blue one or a brown one, especially during St. Patrick's Day weekend when we put a little bit of extra eco-friendly green dye in the river to be festive. Now you'll notice the bottom of the Nuveen building is covered over with stone. Well, you see that train going by the building? That's our elevated train. Here in Chicago, we don't have a subway for the most part, because there's too much water downtown. We constantly be pumping water out of the tunnels. So instead we put our trains up in the air. We called in the elevated train, or the L for short. Now these trains can be awfully noisy. You don't want an office next to that going by multiple times an hour throughout the day. You have a migraine before you're even finished with your first day at work. And Cohn Pedersen Fox knew that. That's why the bottom of the building's